Hello everyone and welcome. This is the Goodly Christian Witch. I'd like to read another chapter for you for Lammas from this book, Janet and Stewart Farrar, a book I love and I've owned for quite a while. The beautiful cover. It's a beautiful cover. And again, 8 Sabbats for Witches, Janet and Stewart Farrar. It shows the coven standing around the moon, sort of like almost like a ring around Saturn, that kind of a thing. A bonfire and the beautiful forest and beautiful trees with a beautiful lake. And we have with us here, we have representations of the goddess in Mother Mary, representation of the God for Jesus Christ, her son. We have the angel who brings flowers, which we have Jesus helping bring flowers, and we have the angel who's playing the flute. So we're going to now get into this book. We're going to once again read you some of the pages that precede the chapter we're going to read by the same authors. What Witches Do, The Witch's Goddess, The Witch's Way, 8 Sabbats for Witches and Rites for Birth, Marriage, and Death by Janet and Stewart Farrar, with line illustrations by Stewart Farrar and photographs by Ian David and Stewart Farrar. Phoenix Publishing, Inc. Copyright Janet and Stewart Farrar, 1981. Again, Phoenix Publishing, Inc., Portal Way, P.O. Box 10, Custer, Washington, USA, 98240. And it says, it's dedicated to one of their friends. It says, and ye shall meet and know and remember and love them again. So we're going to now turn to chapter 8 for the festival of Lughnasadh. And chapter 8 begins with being the date of July 31st, the date of July 31st. Now there's some other dates that are like August 1st in some of the varying cultures where the date is like 1 or 2 days different, or the name of it is slightly different. But a lot of this is addressed in this book. And so we're going to just go ahead and read this to you now. And it's a little bit longer than the last one we read. And it goes from page 102 and it goes all the way to 115. And again, it's chapter 8, Lughnasadh, 31st July. Lughnasadh, and it shows you how to pronounce it, L-O-O-N-U-S-U-H. It looks like the D is silent, so it's pronounced Lughnasadh, means, in disclosure quotes, the commemoration of Lu. And that's the end of the quotes, the disclosure quotes. In its simplified spelling, Lughnasadh, it is Irish Gaelic for the month of August, as Lughnasadh or Lughnasadh. It is Scottish Gaelic for Lammas, 1st August, and the Manx equivalent is La'a Lunis or La'a Lunis. Since it has to do with the moon so much, perhaps that's where the word loony comes from. Now, in Scotland, the period from a fortnight before Lughnasadh to a fortnight after is known as Iuchar, while in the Dingle Peninsula of County Kerry, the second fortnight is known as An Lughnasadh, the Dark Lugh Festival, suggesting, quote, that they are echoes of a lunar reckoning whereby Lughnasadh would have been celebrated in conjunction with a phase of the moon. So, and then unquote. So again, that they, quote, that they are echoes of a lunar reckoning whereby Lughnasadh would have been celebrated in conjunction with a phase of the moon, unquote. And then it says, this quote is from Marie McNeil, the book, The Festival of Lughnasadh, page 16. Continuing, throughout the British Isles, not only in the Celtic fringe, and that's in disclosure quotes, Celtic fringe, unquote, but also in such places as County Durham and Yorkshire. Lughnasadh folk customs have attached themselves almost entirely to the Sunday before or the Sunday after 1st August, not merely through Christianization, but because they involved large gatherings of people, often on mountains or high hills, which were possible only on the days of leisure which Christianity had conveniently provided. Of the Lughnasadh survivals in these islands, Ireland supplies a veritable gold mine, partly because, as we have already pointed out, in Ireland rural culture has been far less eroded by urban culture than elsewhere, but also for another historical reason. During the centuries when the Catholic religion was proscribed or persecuted, the Irish peasantry, deprived of their buildings of worship, clung all the more fervently to the open-air holy places which were all that was left to them. So, obeying an urge far older than Christianity, priests and people together climbed their sacred heights or sought out the magical wells to mark those turning points in Mother Earth's year, which were too important to them to be unacknowledged merely because their churches were roofless or requisitioned by an alien creed. On such heights as Croagh-Patrick, they still do. More of that later. Marie McNeil's book quoted above brings together an astonishing wealth of these survivals. 700 pages of customs, folklore, and root legend which should not be missed by any serious student of the 8 festivals. Who is Lugh? He was a fire and light god of the Baal Hercules type. His name may be from the same root as the Latin lux, meaning light, which also gives us Lucifer, and then disclosure quotes, the light bringer, end of quote. He is really the same god as Baal, Beli, Balor, but a later and more sophisticated version of him. In mythology, the historical replacing of one god by a later form, following invasion, for example, or a revolutionary advance in technology, is often remembered as the killing, blinding, or emasculization of the older by the younger. While the essential continuity is acknowledged by making the younger into the son or grandson of the elder. If the superseded deity is a goddess, she often reappears as the wife of the newcomer. Thus Lugh, in Irish legend, was a leader of the Tuatha De Danann, the peoples of the goddess Dana. The last but one conquerors of Ireland in the mythological cycle, while Balor was king of the formers, whom the Tuatha De defeated, and in the battle Lugh blinded Balor. Yet according to most versions, Balor was his grandfather, and Dana or Danu was Balor's wife. In this case, marriage demoted Balor, not Dana. Other versions make Lugh Balor's son. The folklore of our own village does, apparently, as Marie McNeil, and this is page 408 from that reference, records, quote, from Ballycroy in Mayo comes a saying proverbial in thunderstorms. Ta ga oth lua lam fada ag etal anoch san seda agus drithilogai e athar Balor Baymin and Tather, and that what it means in modern English is, Lug, long arms, wind is flying in the air tonight. Yes, and the sparks of his father, Balor Bayman. Lug, then, is Balor all over again, and certainly associated with a technological revolution. In the legend of the Tuatha de Victory, Lug spares the life of Bress, a captured enemy leader, in exchange for advice on plowing, sowing, and reaping. Quote, the story clearly contains a harvest myth in which the secret of agricultural prosperity is wrested from a powerful and reluctant god by Lug. That's McNeil, and that's page 5. Lug's superior cleverness and versatility is indicated by his titles Lughnasadh, pronounced Lu-la-va-vada, and Samhioldanic, Savildwanuk, with the CH as in Loch, like in Loch Ness Monster, I guess. Okay, continuing, quote, equally skilled in the arts, unquote. His Welsh equivalent, grandson of Beli and Dawn, is Lu La Gyphus. And that's variously translated as, quote, the lion with the steady hand, unquote, Graves, and, quote, the shining ones with the skillful hand, unquote, Gantz. Significantly, Lug is often the patron deity of a town, such as Carlisle, Luguvalium, Lyon in France, Leyden in Holland, and Legnicia is German, or Lignitz in Poland. Towns were alien to the earlier Celts, their first continental. Towns were for commercial convenience in trading with the Mediterranean civilizations from which they copied them for strong points in extracting tribute from the trade routes, or later as a result of the absorption of Celtic Gaul into the patterns of the Roman Empire. Of the British Celts, a writer as late as Strabo, that's 55 BC to AD 25, could still say, quote, their cities are the woods. They enclose a large area with felled trees and set up huts to house themselves and their animals, never with the intention of staying very long in these places, unquote. So by the time the Celts got around to naming towns, Balor had been outshone by Lug, apart from the fact that a large proportion of the population of those towns would be craftsmen, naturally devoted to Lug, Samhioldanic. Talking of takeovers, they happen, of course, with the arrival of Christianity, too. A prime example is Saint Michael, who was a later form of the Lucifer he defeated. T.C. Lethbridge, in Witches, investigating an ancient religion, has shown how many parish churches of St. Michael coincide with places where Lug, the Celtic Lucifer, or, in disclosure quotes, Lightbringer, unquote, would have been worshipped. Pre-Reformation churches, that is, post-Reformation church builders, seem to have lost all sense of place magic. And Michael, in magical tradition, rules the fire element. That Lug is also a type of the god who undergoes death and rebirth, and a sacrificial mating with the goddess is most clearly seen in the legend of his Welsh manifestation, Lu La Gyphs. This story appears as part of the romance of Math, the son of Mathonwy, in the Mabin Ogoin. Graves gives Lady Charlotte's Guest translation of it in The White Goddess. Graves also says on page 178, quote, the Anglo-Saxon form of Lugomas, Mass in honor of the god Lug, or Lu, was half-mass, or in disclosure quotes, loaf mass, unquote, with reference to the corn harvest and the killing of the corn king, unquote. The Celtian games held in Ireland at Lughnasadh were originally funeral games, traditionally in honor of Lug's dead foster mother, Telte. But, as Graves points out on page 302, this tradition, quote, is late and misleading, unquote. The wake games were clearly to honor the sacrificed Lugh himself, and unless one grasps the meaning of the sacrificial mating theme, one might be puzzled by the apparent contradiction that an early Irish tradition also refers to the wedding feats of Lugh at Teltiu. In a sense, this too is a blurring of a half-remembered story, for he who mates with the goddess at harvest is already her waning year consort. As Marie McNeill rightly says on page 424, before I get to the quote, I'd like to read the footnote here. The footnote on number 1, on the whole subject of place magic, not only of places of worship, but also, for example, of such things as Beltane fires, Tom Graves' Needles of Stone is practically essential reading for witches who want not merely to feel, but to understand and experiment constructively with their relationship to Earth as a living organism. There's often this is an aside by me, by the Goodly Christian Witch, I like to say, there's often very important information in footnotes, which is why I don't want to ignore them, unless it might get a little carried away, but we'll see how we do. I could read it at the end if it becomes too disruptive. So I'd like to continue now with this quote. I'll start with this sentence again, the last sentence on page 105. As Marie McNeill rightly says on page 424, quote, Lughnasadh, I would suggest, was one episode in the cycle of a divine marriage story, but not necessarily the bridal time, unquote. So in Lughnasadh we have the autumn parallel to the Beltane sacrificial mating with the god of the waxing year. On the human level, it is interesting that the Beltane Greenwood marriages were paralleled by the Lughnasadh Teltown marriages, i.e. Tailtean trial marriages, which would be dissolved after a year and a day by the couple returning to the place where the union was celebrated and walking away from each other to north and south. Wiccan hand fasting has the same provision. The couple can dissolve it after a year and a day by returning to the high priestess who hand fasted them and informing her. Teltown, modern Irish Teltian, Old Irish Teltiu, is a village in County Meath where tradition remembers a hillock of the bride price, unquote, and a, quote, marriage hollow, unquote, that's the disclosure quotes, that Teltian fair seems in later centuries to have become a mere marriage market with boys and girls kept apart till contracts were signed, but its origins must have been very different. It stemmed, in fact, from the Onach, or tribal gathering of pagan times, of which the Onach of Teltiu was the most important, being associated with the High King, whose royal seat of Tara is only 15 miles away. McNeill, pages 311 to 338. These gatherings were a mixture of tribal business, horse racing, athletic contests, and ritual to ensure good fortune, and Lughnasadh was a favorite time for them. The Leinster Onyach of Carmen, the Wexford Goddess, McNeill, pages 339 to 344, for example, was held on the banks of the River Barrow for the week beginning with the Lughnasadh feast to secure for the tribe, quote, corn and milk, mast and fish, and freedom from aggression by any outsider, unquote. Geroid Mac Neilcal, Ireland Before the Vikings, page 49. Quote, such deep-rooted traditions could not be jettisoned and had perforce to be tolerated and as far as possible Christianized. Thus in 784 the Onach of Teltown, Teltiu, was sanctified by the relics of Eric of Slane. Mac Neocalical, Mac Neocal, also says on page 25 that Columcille, better known outside Ireland as Saint Columba, is credited with a bid to take over Lughnasadh, quote, by converting it to a, this is a quote within a quote, feast of the ploughmen, that's the end of the inner quote, not apparently with any great success, unquote. The ritual behavior of the king as the sacred personification of the tribe was particularly important. At Lughnasadh, for example, the king of Tara's diet had to include fish from the Boyne, venison from Lughnasadh, bilberries from Brilith near Ardagh, and other obligatory items. Mac Nicolau 47. The bilberries are significant. See below. A formidable list of the taboos surrounding the Roman sacred king, the Flamen Dialis, is given by Fraser. The Golden Bough, page 230. Graves, the White Goddess, page 130, points out what Fraser omits, that the Flamen, a Hercules-type figure, owed his position to his sacred marriage with the Flamennica. He could not divorce her, and if she died, he had to resign. It is the role of the sacred king to bow to the goddess queen. This brings us straight back to Lughnasadh, for Graves goes on, quote, in Ireland this Hercules was named Ken Cruach, quote, within the quote, the Lord of the Mound, unquote, but after his supersession by a more benignant sacred king was remembered as Crom Cruach, the beloved one of the Mound, unquote. Crom Cruach, the usual modern spelling, also called Crom Dub, the black-bowed one, was a sacrificial god particularly associated with Lughnasadh. The last Sunday in July is still known as Domnach Crom Dub, Crom Dub Sunday, even though it has been Christianized. On that day, every year, thousands of pilgrims climb Ireland's holy mountain, whose summit can be seen through our study window. The 2,510-foot Croagh Patrick in County Mayo, where St. Patrick is said to have fasted for 40 days and defeated a host of demons. And then there is it's an aside by me. There is a footnote from the sentence we just read, and I'll read that since it's not too long. We'll read the footnote about that in a moment. Let me just finish the sentence here at the end. The last two sentences. The observance used to be a 3-day one. So the observance says the observance used to be a 3-day one, starting on Ain Crom Dub, the Friday preceding. It is still Ireland's most spectacular pilgrimage. So now this footnote. As we were writing this, Ireland's most respected newspaper even suggested that Domnach Crom Dub should replace 17th March, the present St. Patrick's Day, as Ireland's national day. St. Patrick's Day in 1979 was celebrated in a blizzard. We watched the Dublin parade and felt desperately sorry for the drenched and frozen majorettes clad in little more than braided tunics and brave smiles. 2 days later, the Irish Times, in a first leader headed "Why March 17?" asked, quote, "Would it not be better for all if the national holiday were celebrated when our weather is more bland? There was one day which is, if not historically, at least in the legendary sense, opposite and from the weather point of view more acceptable. That is the last Sunday in July, Garland Sunday or Domnach Crom Dubh," citing Marie McNeil's The Festival of Lughnasadh to support this argument. It ended, quote, if any interest, therefore, wants to sponsor another date and a valid one for remembering our saint, the folklore files give a ready answer," unquote. Ireland's gift for pagan Christian continuity is clearly indestructible. We are tempted to wonder whether, in this epoch of religious change, it will work both ways. Or I guess they're wondering if it's going to work both ways. Okay. So now we had read all of this. Now we're going to continue here with the top of page 108. The sacrifice of Crom himself seems to have been enacted in very ancient times by the sacrifice of human substitutes at a phallic stone surrounded by 12 other stones, the sacrificial hero king's traditional number of companions. The 11th century book of Leinster says, with Christian distaste, quote, "In a rank stand 12 idols of stone, bitterly to enchant the people. The figure of the Crom was of gold," unquote. This was at Mag Slech, the plain of ordination, generally held to be around Killyclugan in County Cavan, where there is a stone circle and the shattered remains of a phallic stone carved with Iron Age decorations, in keeping with the tradition that St. Patrick overthrew the Crom stone. Later, the sacrifice seems to have been that of a bull, of which there are many hints, though only one which can be specifically linked with Crom Dubh. That is from the north shore of Galway Bay. Quote, "It tells of the tradition that a beef animal was skinned and roasted to ashes in honor of Crom Dubh on his festival day, and that this had to be done by every householder." McNeil, page 407. Many legends speak of the death and resuscitation of a sacred bull, page 410, and accepting that Croag, Patrick, must have been a sacrificial mountain long before St. Patrick took it over, we cannot help wondering if there is significance in the fact that Westport, the town that commands its approaches, has for its Gaelic name Cathair na Mart, city of the beeves. But underlying all the legends we have mentioned so far is an older fertility theme, which shines through many of the still remembered festival customs. Baelor, Bress, and Crom Dubh are all forms of the elder god, to whom belong the power to produce. Along comes his son/other self, the bright young god Horus, to his Osiris, the many-gifted Lugh, who rests from the fruits of that power. Even the colorful St. Patrick legends echo this victory. Quote, "St. Patrick must be a latecomer to the mythological legends and must have displaced a former actor. If we restore Lugh to the role taken by St. Patrick, the legends at once acquire new meaning." McNeil, page 409. In the legends of this fertility victory, and also, doubtless, as Marie McNeil points out, at one time in the enacted Lughnasadh ritual, Crom Dubh is often buried in the ground up to the neck for 3 days and then released once the harvest fruits have been guaranteed. a sign of the success of the rite is given by, of all things, the humble bilberry, whortleberry, blaeberry. Domic Crom Dub has other names, including Garland Sunday and Garlic Sunday, and one of them is Frauhan Sunday, from the Gaelic Frauhan Frauhog, for bilberry. On that day still, young people go picking bilberries with various traditional jollifications, though the custom seems unfortunately to be waning. The forms of the tradition make it quite clear that the bilberries were regarded as a reciprocal gift from the god, a sign that the Lughnasadh ritual had succeeded. Their plentifulness, or otherwise, was taken as a forecast of the size of the harvest. The fact that the two rituals were complementary is still underlined in our locality by the fact that while adults climb Croagh Patrick on Domha Crom Dub, children are climbing the mountains of the Curran Peninsula just across the bay to pick bilberries. Another Frauhan Sunday site is Carrigrow near Ferns in County Wexford, a 771-foot mountain on the flank of which our first Irish home stood. Within living memory, large crowds used to gather there, for the picking, and flowers would be placed on the giant's bed. A shelf in the rock which forms the summit. A shelf in the rock which forms the summit. Our plate 11 was photographed on that rock. The fertility association is specific in the joke made to us by more than one neighbor that half the population of Ferns was conceived on the giant's bed, though doubtless that particular ritual has become private rather than communal. Incidentally, folk memories of the magical significance of that little mountain are enshrined in an unwritten local saying passed to us independently by at least two neighbors, both of whom made it clear that they were commenting on our presence there as witches. Quote, "As long as Carrigrow stands, there will be people who know," unquote. We certainly found it magically supercharged. Throughout Britain and Ireland, Christianity notwithstanding, the May Eve Greenwood lovemaking which so shocked the Puritans found its cheerful echo not only among the bilberries, but in the Lammas or Lughnasadh cornfields, on which theme, if you like songs at your Sabbats, Robert Burns's "It Was Upon a Lammas Night," quote, "corn rigs and barley rigs, and corn rigs are bonny. I'll ne'er forget that happy night amang the rigs wi' Annie," is both appropriate and delightful. The three Machas, the triple goddess in her battle aspect, appear as the triune patroness of the Lughnasadh festival, bringing us back to the sacrificial theme. Another hint is that it was at Lammas that King William Rufus fell to Sir Walter Tyrrell's disclosure, quote, "accidental," unquote, arrow on the New Forest in 1100, a death which, as Margaret Murray and others have pervasively argued, was in fact his willing ritual sacrifice at the end of his term as divine king, and was so understood and honored by his people. The nursery rhyme, quote, "who killed Cock Robin," unquote, is said to commemorate this event. But what of the sacrificial mating theme as a single concept, instead of as two separate ones of sacrifice and sexuality? Has this vanished altogether in Irish tradition? Not quite. In the first place, that tradition, as it has reached us, is mainly a god and hero one, though with the goddess hovering powerfully in the background. And it has reached us largely through medieval Christian monks who wrote down a body of oral legend, albeit surprisingly sympathetically, scribes whose conditioning perhaps made it difficult for them to recognize goddess clues. But the clues are there, particularly in the recurrent theme of the rivalry of two heroes, gods, over a heroine, goddess. This theme is not confined to the Irish Celts. It appears, for example, in the legend of Jack the Tinkard, who can be regarded as a Cornish Lugh, and significantly, as with the Oak King and the Holly King, these heroes often alternately successful. Let me say that sentence again. And significantly, as with the Oak King and Holly King, these heroes are often alternately successful. So that talks about, this is my aside here, that it's talking about the yearly battle of the Holly King and the battle of the Holly King and the Oak King that we had talked about before. Okay, now we're going back to the book, continuing. And what is Crom Dubh's 3-day burial up to the neck in Mother Earth, and his release when her fertility is assured, but a sacrificial mating and rebirth? So, in our own Lughnasadh ritual, we have kept to that theme. When our coven first tried out the love-chaste enactment of the sacrificial mating at Beltane 1977, we found it very successful. It portrayed the theme vividly, but without grimness. We saw no reason why it should not be repeated, with modifications appropriate to the harvest season at Lughnasadh, and that is what we have done. Because the high priestess at Lughnasadh invokes the goddess into herself and delays this invocation until after the death, quote unquote, the disclosure quotes, of the Holly King, we felt it more suitable in the opening ritual to have the high priest deliver the charge for her. He quotes the goddess instead of the high priestess speaking as the goddess. Normally, we like to give an active role in the ritual to as many people as possible, but it will be noticed that in this Lughnasadh rite, the men, apart from the high priest, have practically nothing to do between the love chase and the final ring dance. This is in keeping with the tradition surrounding the death of the Corn King. In many places, it was a mystery between the women of the tribe and their solitary sacred victim, which no other man was allowed to witness. In our Sabbat, the men can always get their own back during the party stage forfeits. It says the high priest's declamation, quote, "I am a battle-waging spear," unquote, is again from the song of Amergin, this time according to Graves' allocation for the second half of the year. The preparation. A small loaf is placed on the altar, most suitable as a soft roll or bap. That's a disclosure quote and unquote bap, B-A-P. A green scarf or piece of gauze, at least a yard square, is laid by the altar. If cassette music is used, the high priestess may wish to have one piece of music for the main ritual plus another of an insistent, even primitive rhythm for her corn dance, since it, unlike the midsummer dance, is not accompanied by chanting. The high priest should have a crown of holly combined with ears of a grain crop. The women, many wear grain crop chaplets, perhaps interwoven with red poppies. Grain, poppies, and bilberries, if available, are particularly suitable for the altar with other seasonal flowers. The cauldron decorated with stems of grain is by the east candle, the quarter of rebirth. The ritual. In the opening ritual, drawing down the moon is omitted. The high priest gives the high priestess the five-fold kiss, and then immediately himself delivers the charge, substituting, quote, she, her, hers, unquote, for, quote, I, me, my, mine, unquote. After the witch's rune, The coven spread themselves around the circle and start a soft rhythmic clapping. The high priestess picks up the green scarf, gathers it lengthwise like a rope, and holds it with one end in each hand. He starts to move towards the high priestess, making it as though to throw the scarf over her shoulders and pull her to him. But she backs away from him tantalizingly. While the coven continue their rhythmic clapping, the high priestess continues to elude the pursuing high priest. She beckons to him and teases him, but always steps back before he can capture her with the scarf. She weaves in and out of the coven, and the other women step in the high priest's way to help her elude him. After a while, say after 2 or 3 laps of the circle, the high priestess allows the high priest to capture her by throwing the scarf over her head to behind her shoulders and pulling her to him. They kiss and separate, and the high priest hands the scarf to another man. The other man then pursues his partner, who eludes him, beckons to him, and teases him in exactly the same way. The clapping goes on all the time. See plate 12. After a while, she too allows herself to be captured and kissed. The man then hands the scarf to another man, and the pursuit game continues until every couple in the room has taken part. The last man hands the scarf back to the high priest. Once again, the high priest pursues the high priestess, but this time the pace is much slower, almost stately, and her eluding and beckoning more solemn, as though she is tempting him into danger. And this time the others do not intervene. The pursuit continues until the high priestess places herself facing the altar, and 2 or 3 paces from it, the high priest halts with his back to the altar and captures her with the scarf. They embrace solemnly but wholeheartedly, but after a few seconds of the kiss, the high priest lets the scarf fall from his hands, and the high priestess releases him and takes a step backwards. The high priest drops to his knees, sits back on his heels, and lowers his head, chin on chest. The high priestess spreads her arms, signaling for the clapping to stop. She then calls forward 2 women by name and places them, one on each side of the high priest, facing inwards, so that the 3 of them tower over him. The high priestess picks up the scarf, and the 3 of them spread it between them over the high priest. They lower it slowly and then release it so that it covers his head like a shroud. The coven now spread themselves around the perimeter of the circle facing inwards. The high priestess may then, if she wishes, change the music cassette to her chosen dance theme or signal someone else to do so. She then picks up the small loaf from the altar and holds it for a moment just above the bowed head of the high priest. She then goes to the middle of the circle, holds the loaf up high in the direction of the altar, and invokes, quote, "O mighty mother of us all, bringer of all fruitfulness, give us fruit and grain, flocks and herds, and children to the tribe, that we may be mighty. By the rose of thy love, do thou descend upon the body of thy servant and priestess here," unquote. And footnote 3 we're going to say here, since that was the end of that page. Footnote 3, the Book of Shadows says, "By thy rosy love," that's, quote, the Book of Shadows says, quote, "by thy rosy love," unquote. Doreen Valente queried this, quote, rather meaningless phrase, unquote, with Gardner at the time, suggesting it might be a corruption of, quote, "by thy rose of love," unquote, or, quote, "by the rose of thy love," unquote, the rose being a symbol of the goddess as well as Britain's national flower. We have followed the second of her suggestions. After a moment's pause, and gently at first, she starts her corn dance, all the time carrying the loaf as a sacred and magical object. See plate 13. She finishes her dance by standing facing the high priest, who is still motionless and, quote unquote, in disclosure, dead, unquote, with the loaf in her two hands, and saying, quote, "Gather round, O children of the harvest," unquote. The rest of the coven gather round the high priestess and the kneeling high priest. If the high priestess and the maiden do not know their words by heart, the maiden may bring the script and one altar candle and stand beside the high priestess, where they both can read it, since the high priestess's hands are both occupied. The high priestess says, quote, "Behold, the Holly King is dead, he who is also the Corn King. He has embraced the Great Mother and died of his love. So has it been year by year since time began. But if the Holly King is dead, if the Holly King is dead, he who is the God of the waning year, all is dead. All that sleeps in my womb of earth would sleep forever. What shall we do, therefore, that the Holly King may live again?" The maiden says, quote, "Give us to eat the bread of life. Then shall sleep lead on to rebirth," unquote. The high priestess says, quote, "So mote it be," unquote. The maiden may now replace the script and the altar candle and return to her place beside the high priestess. The high priestess breaks small pieces from the loaf and gives one piece to each witch who eats it. She does not yet eat a piece herself, but keeps enough in her hands for at least 3 more portions. She summons the original 2 women to stand on either side of the high priest. When they are in position, she gestures to them to lift the scarf from the high priest's head. They do so and lay it on the floor. The high priest says, quote, "Come back to us, Holly King, that the land may be fruitful," unquote. The high priest rises and says, quote, "I am a battle-waging spear. I am a salmon in the pool. I am a hill of poetry. I am a ruthless boar. I am a threatening noise of the sea. I am a wave of the sea. Who but I knows the secrets of the unhewn dolmen," unquote. The priestess then gives him a piece of the loaf and takes a piece herself. They both eat, and she replaces the last of the loaf on the altar. High priestess and high priest then lead a ring dance, building up the pace so that it becomes more and more joyous until the high priestess cries, quote, "Down," unquote, and everybody sits. The great rite is then enacted. The remaining portion of the loaf, after the circle has been banished, becomes part of the earth offering along with the last of the wine and cakes. I'm going to read the 4th footnote to you now, since that's the end of the chapter. Like the midsummer dance, the corn dance may be delegated by the high priestess to another woman if she wishes. In this case, she will hand the loaf to the dancer after the invocation and receive it back after the dance, before she takes her place facing the high priest. So this is a very beautiful ritual. I'm going to see if I can find the plates they were referring to regarding plate 11, 12, and 13. Some of these are okay to show. Some maybe a little bit too risque for some things. So I'll just show part of it here for you. These are the plates they're referring to. They're just showing people sitting in circles and sharing cakes and ale, and that wearing their beautiful attire and that kind of thing. Okay. So, again, this is 8 Sabbats for Witches by Janet and Stewart Farrar. And it is a beautiful book, and we'll also be continuing with this for the autumn equinox. We'll read from this book as well. So, this is The Goodly Christian Witch, and Thank you for letting me share this beautiful book with you. Take care.